The lantern moved through the locked wing at 11 minutes past midnight, and Honoria Larkin, who had scrubbed the flagstones of Raysford Hall for 3 years without once losing her composure, felt her hands go still on the linen she was folding, and did not move again for a long moment. She had seen the light from the servants' stair, a thin gold seam beneath the door of the East Gallery, the wing that had been sealed since before her arrival, the wing the Duke of Raysford had told the entire household, upon her very first week in his service, that no one had lived in for 11 years, and no one would live in again. She had believed him. Everyone believed him. It was the sort of flat, final statement a man made only once, in a voice that did not invite a second question. And Julian Ravenscroft, 7th Duke of Raysford, was not a man who invited second questions of any kind. The house at that hour was a study in cold geometry. Stone corridors, holding the day's chill long after the fires below stairs had banked to embers. The moor wind finding every ill-fitted casement and turning it into a low, constant note beneath the silence. Honoria had come to know that note, the way she knew the weight of the copper kettles and the precise creak of the third stair from the bottom. The sort of intimate, unglamorous knowledge that came only to those who served a house, rather than merely lived in it. She knew, too, the particular quality of the darkness in the East Gallery, for she had passed its sealed door 1,000 times with her candle held low, and had never once, in 3 years, seen light beneath it. Tonight, the seam of gold lay across the flagstones, like something spilled and not yet cleaned away, and she stood with the linen forgotten in her arms and felt the old habit of watchfulness rise in her, the habit she had carried out of her father's house along with almost nothing else of value. She had learned, at 19, to read a room before she was asked to enter it, to know which silences meant danger and which meant only grief. And something in the stillness of that light told her this was grief, though she could not yet have said whose. He was compact where dukes in the illustrated papers were always drawn tall, solid through the shoulder in the way of a man who rode his own land rather than merely owned it. And his eyes, when they fixed on a person, were a deep, changeful green, moss in shadow, and something nearer the sea when the light through the long windows caught them right. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. 3 years in his employ had taught Honoria that his silences carried more weight than another man's shouting, and that the wing he had forbidden anyone to enter was the one subject on which his silence had never once cracked. Until tonight. She set down the linen. She told herself, in the practical voice she had cultivated since the age of 19, that a servant who wished to keep her position did not go chasing lanterns through locked wings at midnight. She told herself this twice. Then she took up her own candle and went. The gallery door was not locked. That, more than the light itself, unsettled her, for she had polished that brass handle 100 times and knew its weight, knew it always resisted, knew someone kept it oiled against just such an intrusion as her own. Tonight it gave at a touch, and the sound of its swinging seemed, in the sealed quiet of the corridor, as loud as a shot. Within, the dust sheets had been pulled back from a single chamber, and a woman's portrait hung revealed above a cold hearth, the paint dark with age, but the face beneath it unmistakably kind, unmistakably young, and unmistakably alive, with an expression Honoria had never once seen the Duke wear in 3 years of watching him govern his house like a man serving a sentence. The room smelled of beeswax, long unrenewed, and the particular cold of a hearth that had not held a fire in over a decade. And beneath it, faint as memory, the ghost of cold candle smoke, as though some earlier vigil had left its trace in the very stone. He stood before it with the lantern raised, and when he heard her step he did not startle, which told her, with a small cold drop of understanding, that some part of him had wanted to be found. He did not turn at once. He stood a moment longer, with his eyes on the painted face, and Honoria, watching him from the doorway, understood that she had walked into something far older and far more carefully guarded than mere household mischief, and that whatever answer she received tonight would cost the man before her something she had no right to ask him to pay. "You will forget you saw this," he said, without turning. "I have forgotten a great many things in your service, Your Grace," she said. "I have never yet forgotten anything of consequence." He turned then. Whatever he had expected, fear, retreat, the servile scraping apology of a woman caught where she ought not to be, he did not find it in her. And something in his face, some old iron discipline, seemed for an instant to loosen at the surprise of it. "This is not your concern." "No," she agreed. "It is not." And she did not leave. What no one in that house yet understood was that Honoria Larkin had not always scrubbed flagstones, and that the composure the Duke mistook for a servant's practiced discretion was in fact the discipline of a woman who had once run a household twice this size, who had once read a ledger the way other women read novels, who had come to Raysford Hall under a name that was not entirely a lie, but was very far from the whole truth. She had needed the wages. She had needed more than the wages, to be somewhere her own family could not reach her. And she had calculated, with the same cold competence that had once balanced her late father's failing accounts, that a duke's remote Yorkshire seat was as far from that reach as a respectable woman could travel without vanishing entirely. 3 years was long enough to learn a great many things about her household and its master, and Honoria had learned them the way she had once learned her father's account books, patiently, silently, storing each fact against some future need she could not yet name. She knew that the Duke rose before his own servants, and rode the moor alone, in weather that would have kept a lesser man abed. She knew that he answered his correspondence in his own hand, rather than dictating to a secretary, as though he trusted no one else with the words. She knew that he had never once, in 3 years, raised his voice to a servant, however grave the fault, and that this restraint cost him something visible in the set of his jaw each time he exercised it. She had catalogued him, as she had once catalogued the ledgers of her father's estate, fact by fact, without ever permitting herself to ask why the cataloguing had come, of late, to feel less like a servant's caution, and more like something considerably more dangerous. She had not calculated on the locked wing. She had not calculated on the portrait of a woman with the Duke's own green eyes, nor on the small trunk of boy's clothing beneath the dust sheet in the corner, sized for a child of perhaps 10 years, folded with the particular reverence of someone who could not bear to give the folding to a servant. It was, she thought, the first evidence she had seen in 3 years that the Duke of Raysford possessed a grief of his own, a grief kept as carefully locked as the gallery door itself. And she found, standing there in her nightclothes with her candle guttering, that she wanted very much to know its shape, though she could not, that first night, have said why the wanting felt so much larger than simple curiosity. "My brother," the Duke said, and the 2 words cost him visibly, as though each syllable were drawn up from some great depth. He set the lantern on the mantel beneath the portrait, and, in its steadier light, Honoria could see, for the first time, how young he must have been when whatever happened here had happened, how the room had been sealed, not out of neglect, but out of a grief too raw to be governed by ordinary household rules. This was his chamber, before. "Before what, Your Grace?" He did not answer that night. He set down the lantern, drew the dust sheet back over the portrait with his own hands, and told her, in the flat, final voice she knew so well, that the gallery would be locked again by morning, and that she would speak of this to no one. She said she would not. She kept her word, but she began from that night to watch him differently, the way one watches a house one suspects of standing on rotten foundations, not with fear, but with a kind of grave attention, waiting to see where the first crack would show. It would be many weeks before she learned the whole of it, and she learned it not from him, but from Mrs. Corbould, the housekeeper, who had served 3 Dukes of Raysford, and buried her opinions of all 3, and who told Honoria late one evening, over the mending, of a younger brother named Frederick, wild and beloved, and 11 years dead, ruined at 19 by a debt he could not pay, and a woman who would not marry a second son, and of a scandal the family had spent a fortune and a decade burying so deep that most of society believed the boy had simply died of a fever abroad. He had not died of a fever, Mrs. Corbould said, and her needle stilled in her hand for the length of a breath, the only sign she gave of how much the telling cost her. The old Duke, may he rest, was a hard man, and harder still to a second son who brought disgrace to the name. There were words spoken in that house I have never repeated to a living soul, and words the young master carried out to the mill pond with him, and I will not repeat those either. Not to you, nor to anyone. Not while I have breath in my body. You need not, Honoria said gently, for she recognized in the housekeeper's stillness the particular grief of a servant who has watched a family's worst hour from the one vantage no family ever quite accounts for. I did not ask to know the whole of it. No, Mrs. Corbould agreed, taking up her needle again. But you will, I think, before this house is finished with you. Houses like this one are not in the habit of keeping their secrets forever, whatever the old Duke believed. She said no more that night, and Honoria did not press her, for she had learned in her own ruined family precisely how much a woman could carry, and precisely how little she could bear to be asked to set it down aloud. She began, instead, to make herself useful in ways that were not, strictly, a housemaid's duties. She corrected an error in the estate ledger that the steward had let stand for 2 quarters, quietly, without remark, and left it corrected, where the Duke would find it and wonder. She reorganized the correspondence in the estate office, alphabetical, dated, cross-referenced, in the hand of a woman who had once managed such papers for a household of 40 servants and 11,000 acres. She said nothing of any of it, but the Duke was not a stupid man, whatever his silences might suggest to those who did not look closely, and a fortnight after the night of the lantern, he found her in the linen room and asked her, without preamble, who had taught a Yorkshire housemaid to read a rent roll. My father, she said, before he lost everything he had, including, in the end, his own good sense. She had not meant to say so much. She had said it anyway, and she watched him absorb it, the way a man absorbs a fact he has been quietly gathering evidence toward for weeks. Your name, he said. Is it Larkin? It is the name I use here. He did not press her further, not that day, and she was grateful for it, though she noted, because she noted everything, it was the one luxury poverty had left her, that he had not called for the housekeeper to have her dismissed for insolence, as any other master would have done. He had, instead, begun to seek her out. In the library, where she had no true business but went nonetheless to dust shelves she had already dusted, he would ask her opinion of a book. In the estate office, where she corrected a second error and then a third, he began to leave the ledgers open on the desk at an hour he knew she would pass. But the season was not yet finished with either of them, and the wing was not the only secret the house was keeping. There arrived, in the 5th week, a visitor, the Duke's elder sister, Lady Cordelia Hollingsworth, widowed and resplendent, and entirely unwilling to see her brother's household disturbed by anyone or anything she had not herself approved. She arrived with 4 trunks, a lady's maid who clearly feared her, and the particular restless energy of a woman who had spent 11 years guarding a single secret so carefully that guarding it had become, in itself, the whole occupation of her life. Honoria disliked her within the hour, and was ashamed of the dislike, and disliked her again anyway, for there was something in Lady Cordelia's manner below stairs, a way of addressing the servants as though they were furniture that occasionally required correction, that reminded Honoria, unpleasantly, of the very relations who had turned their backs on her own family the week her father's ruin became public knowledge. The discovery came within a single supper, quite by malicious accident, when Lady Cordelia addressed Honoria in Latin across the dinner service to catch her out before the assembled table. A small cruelty, dressed as idle conversation, the sort of trap a woman lays when she has grown bored of subtler ones. Honoria, too tired and too proud to feign the ignorance that would have kept her safe, answered her correctly, in an accent that betrayed rather more schooling than any housemaid ought to possess. Lady Cordelia's face, in that instant, did something subtle and terrible, the precise expression of a woman recalculating an entire household's worth of small insults she had assumed was safe to make. How extraordinary, she said, in the tone of a woman filing evidence for later use, to find such an education among the linen. My mother believed a woman ought to be able to read whatever was put before her, my lady, Honoria said, linen included. It was, perhaps, too clever an answer for a housemaid to give, and she knew it the moment it left her, watching Lady Cordelia's eyes narrow, with the particular attention of a woman filing away a fact for later use. Honoria did not answer further. She had learned, at 19, exactly what silence cost, and exactly what it saved. And she paid the small cost gladly, rather than hand Lady Cordelia the larger currency of her temper. By the time the candles had burned low that first night of the visit, Lady Cordelia had begun, with the patient malice of a woman who had spent a decade guarding her family's one true wound, to ask pointed questions below stairs about the new housemaid's history, her references, the family she had come from. And it took her considerably less time than it ought to have to discover that the references were, in one particular, a fabrication, and that the woman calling herself Larkin had been born, under a different and once respectable name, into a family whose ruin had been nearly as public, in its season, as the one the Ravenscrofts had spent a fortune burying. She did not go to her brother with this discovery. Not at once. She sat with it for 2 days, turning it over the way a woman turns a piece of jewelry she suspects of being paste, testing its weight, deciding how best to spend it. And it was this hesitation, more than any single act of malice, that revealed her true nature to those below stairs who watched her closely. A woman who did not act from sudden temper, but from careful, patient calculation, which made her, in her way, considerably more dangerous than a woman who merely shouted. She went, in the end, to the local magistrate's wife, a woman fond of gossip and fonder still of currying favour with the Duke's sister, and let it be known, in the careful, deniable manner of her kind, that Raysford Hall was harbouring a servant of doubtful character and disputed origin, a woman who might, for all anyone truly knew, be angling after a position considerably above a housemaid's station. Had anyone been watching closely, they might have seen that this was not concerned for the Duke's welfare at all, but the oldest fear of the eldest sibling. That a brother once burned by scandal, once made cold and armoured by a single family catastrophe, might now be thawing toward a woman whose own past made a second scandal not merely possible, but, in Lady Cordelia's private calculation, dangerously likely. The rumour reached Honoria before it reached the Duke, carried below stairs by a scullery girl too frightened to keep it to herself, and Honoria understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had watched one family's ruin from the inside, precisely what would happen next. Dismissal without character, and with it, the final door closed against any respectable position anywhere in England. A servant dismissed for disputed origins, for a fabricated reference, might as well be dismissed for theft. The Tun's memory for such distinctions was short, and its judgment, once formed, was permanent. She spent that day performing her duties with the same steady composure she had maintained for 3 years, folding linen, correcting a 4th error in the estate ledger, answering Mrs. Corbold's questions in her usual even voice. And no one below stairs, watching her, would have guessed that she carried, beneath that composure, the particular vertigo of a woman who has watched the ground shift once already in her life, and recognizes, with sick familiarity, the first tremor of its shifting again. She did not weep. She did not protest. She did not go to the Duke and plead her case, though she might have, though a lesser woman would have. For pleading had never once, in her experience, altered the outcome of a scandal already loosed upon a household. She went instead to her small room beneath the eaves and took out the one object she had carried with her through 3 years and 2 false names. A letter in her late father's hand, written in the final week of his life, that named the true circumstances of his ruin, and named, too, the man who had engineered it. A man she now understood, from Mrs. Corbold's careful account and her own quiet arithmetic, to be the very same faithless connection who had, 11 years before, ruined a wild and beloved younger son named Frederick Ravenscroft, and driven him, in the end, not abroad, but into the cold water of the mill pond behind this very house, in a season the family had spent a fortune ensuring the world would call a fever. She had not known, until that night with the ledgers fresh in her mind, that the debt which broke her father, and the debt which broke Frederick Ravenscroft, had been engineered by one and the same hand. Lady Cordelia, for her part, had not expected her brother to hesitate, and his hesitation, once she perceived it, only sharpened her resolve. She had watched him, across a week of suppers, seek out the housemaid's opinion on a book, linger in the estate office at an hour that owed nothing to estate business, and she recognized in it the precise shape of the thing she had spent 11 years guarding against. A second scandal, born this time not of a brother's weakness, but of a brother's heart. And she resolved that she would end it before it could take root, whatever the cost to the woman standing in its way. She wrote that same week to a cousin in London with connections to the registry offices where domestic references were verified, requesting, with the deniable delicacy of a woman who had spent a lifetime arranging things at one remove, a closer look into the particulars of one Honoria Larkin, lately of no fixed situation before Raysford, and she let it be known below stairs, in the same breath, that she expected the matter resolved to the family's satisfaction before the month was out. It was not yet an accusation. It was the machinery of one, set quietly in motion, and Honoria, watching Lady Cordelia's maid pack a second post-bag for London within the same week, understood exactly what kind of machinery it was, for she had watched precisely such wheels turn once before, in her father's case, and knew how little time remained once they had properly begun to move. It would have been so easy, she thought, turning the letter over in the candlelight, to use it, to go to the Duke and say, "Your sister spreads rumors of my disgrace, but I hold in my hand the name of the man who orchestrated both our family's ruin, and if she does not silence herself, I shall see that name spoken aloud in every drawing room from here to London." It would have answered Lady Cordelia entirely. It would also, she understood with a clean, cold certainty, have handed the Duke a fresh wound in the exact shape of his oldest one, forced him to relive in public the very grief he had spent 11 years and a fortune trying to seal behind a locked door. She would not do it. She decided this before the candle had burned another inch, and the deciding cost her something she did not examine too closely, because examining it would have meant admitting how much, in 5 short weeks, she had come to care what became of a man who was not permitted, by every rule of her situation, to become anything to her at all. The Duke found her the following morning in the estate office, the letter still folded in her apron pocket, and asked her, in the flat voice she had once mistaken for coldness and now understood to be armor worn so long it had become skin, whether the rumors his sister carried below stairs held any truth. "Some," she said. "Not all. I will not insult you with the whole of a lie, Your Grace, nor hand you the whole of a truth that is not mine alone to give." "Then give me what is yours to give." She set down her pen. The office at that hour held only the two of them, and the grey Yorkshire light through the tall window, and she was aware, in a way she had not permitted herself to be aware of anything in 3 careful years, of the small distance between his chair and her own, and of how little either of them seemed inclined just then to preserve it. She told him her name. She told him of her father, of the debt, of the ruin, of the 2 false names, and the 3 years of scrubbing floors that had followed. And she watched his face change through the telling, the way she had watched, months before, the portrait's dust sheet drawn back to reveal a grief he had never once permitted the household to witness. He did not interrupt her. He listened, the way she imagined he read his own correspondence, with total and unhurried attention. And when she came to the end of it, to the small room beneath the eaves, to the letter she still had not fully explained, he was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder whether her honesty had cost her more than her silence would have. "You might have told me none of this," he said at last, "and I would very likely never have known." "I am aware of that also, Your Grace." "Then why?" "Because you have spent 3 years believing yourself served by a woman who exists only within the narrow shape of her duties," she said. "And I found, somewhere in the last several weeks, that I no longer wished to be believed in only partially." She did not tell him the name in the letter, not yet, though she felt it sitting in her apron pocket like a stone. She was still deciding, even as she spoke, whether that particular grace was hers to grant, or his to demand. "You corrected my ledgers," he said, when she had finished, "for 3 years, and told no one." "It seemed unkind to embarrass your steward." Something moved through his face that was very nearly a laugh. The first she had ever seen threatened to break there, though it did not quite arrive. "My sister means to have you dismissed." "I am aware." I will not permit it. Your Grace, I have spent 11 years, he said, and here his voice, for the first time in 3 years of her service, did not hold entirely steady. Permitting my sister to manage this house according to her fears. Because her fears were, for a long while, the only thing standing between this family and a second scandal. I find I am tired of it. I find, and he looked at her directly now, the green of his eyes very dark in the office's grey light, that I am considerably more afraid of losing a woman who tells me the truth than I am of anything my sister might say to the magistrate's wife. It was not a declaration. It was, she understood, something more dangerous than a declaration. An admission, offered without demand for anything in return, from a man who had not offered an admission of any kind to another living soul in 11 years. She told him, then, the name in the letter. She watched it land. She watched him go very still, the particular stillness of a man absorbing, in a single sentence, both the answer to a grief he had carried for over a decade and the knowledge that the woman before him had carried the same wound, from the opposite direction, without once using it to buy her own safety. He asked her, quietly, why she had not simply given the name to silence his sister and end the matter. Because you had already lost your brother to that man's cruelty, she said. I would not hand you a second grief in the shape of the first, merely to purchase myself a night's peace. He did not answer her in words. He crossed the small distance of the office and took her hand, not as a duke takes the hand of a housemaid, but as a man takes the hand of the one person in 11 years who had shown him more grace than his grief had ever asked him to extend to anyone else. And he held it, as though it were the single steadiest thing in a house built, room upon room, out of secrets. The reckoning that followed was neither swift nor spectacular. The Duke did not summon the magistrate, nor stage any public unmasking of the man who had ruined 2 families a decade apart. He had learned, from watching Honoria choose silence over vengeance, that some truths were better carried to a quiet grave than paraded for the ton's entertainment. He wrote, instead, a single letter, precise and devastating in its restraint, that ended, within the season, the man's remaining credit and standing in every circle that mattered, without ever naming the crime aloud. It was the letter of a man who no longer needed to shout to be obeyed, and every recipient of its careful sentences understood it as such. Lady Cordelia's own reckoning came more quietly still. Her brother summoned her to the estate office, the same room in which Honoria had, weeks before, laid down the whole of her history, and informed her, in a private interview neither sister nor housemaid ever fully recounted to the rest of the household, that the woman she had sought to have dismissed and disgraced held in her possession the very name their family had spent 11 years and a considerable fortune burying, and had chosen silence and grace over exposure at her own considerable cost, when exposure would have served her rather better. Lady Cordelia left Raceford Hall within the week, her trunks packed with rather less ceremony than they had arrived with, her manus replaced, for once in her life, by something that might, in a lesser woman, have been called shame, and that in her own case settled, more permanently, into a chastened and lasting quiet. The locked wing was opened before the year's end, the dust sheets carried away, the portrait rehung in the main gallery, where a family might look upon a lost son without flinching. The Duke himself oversaw the unshuttering of the windows, and Mrs. Corbould, who had served 3 Dukes of Raceford and had never once seen the master of the house perform such labour with his own hands, remarked afterward, to no one in particular, that she had not believed she would live to see that gallery filled with ordinary daylight again. Honoria Larkin. She kept the name, in the end, for it had become as true as the one she was born to, truer, perhaps, since it was the name under which she had first been fully and honestly known, became, within 2 years, the Duchess of Raceford, and ran the estate's ledgers herself, correcting errors before her steward could make them. In a hand the whole household came, in time, to trust above any other in the house. She was not, in those first years, universally welcomed by every quarter of the county, for a duchess risen from the servants' hall was precisely the sort of history the ton preferred to whisper about rather than accept outright. But she had weathered worse whispers than theirs, and she met them with the same composure that had once carried her through 3 years of scrubbing another woman's floors. There are arrangements, and there are marriages, and the two are rarely the same. And theirs, born of a lantern crossing a forbidden gallery at midnight, was neither an arrangement nor merely a marriage, but something earned slowly, in the particular currency of two people who had each been given every reason to use the other's ruin, and had each, instead, chosen grace. He was still, in company, a quiet man, still slower to speak than other men of his rank. But the household noticed, within that first year, that his silences had changed their character entirely. No longer the silence of a door kept locked against the world, but the ordinary quiet of a man content in his own house. Years later, when the letters were finally read, for there were letters in the end, that Honoria judged safe at last to show him in full, her father's among them, laid beside the small trunk of boys' clothing that had once waited beneath the dust sheet. Their children would ask why the East Gallery held 2 portraits instead of the customary 1, and would be told, in time, the whole quiet history of a lantern, a locked door, and 2 people who had each been offered the easy cruelty of using the other's ruin, and had each chosen, instead, the harder and better thing. The wing stood open from then on, its windows unshuttered to the moorlight, and no lantern ever again needed to cross it in secret, for there was, at last, nothing left in that house that required the dark to hide it.